Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
Currently, we have 3 million people using food banks. How, as a Prime Minister who is richer than the King, can relate to any of our needs and struggles?
Trying to get an appointment with a doctor is hard.
Double the sewage, despite the promises that have been made to clean up our waterways and cut the use of storm overflows.
Have you ever gone without something? What did you go without as a child? Sky TV?
Except I earn a lot of money in the job I am now in. But when I grew up, my dad was a toolmaker. He worked in a factory. It's true. My mum was a nurse and actually...
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Ideas, the Marxist podcast from Socialist Alternative. The Tories are on their way out. Sunak's disastrous election campaign shows the scale of crisis facing the Tory party. The working class majority in society has decided it's had enough. After 14 years in office, we've seen ruthless austerity, a crumbling NHS, the super rich getting richer and the rest of us getting poorer. But a Labour government will be just as committed to serving the interests of big business. This is why Socialist Alternative thinks a new left anti-war political party with socialist policies urgently needs to be built, so we can challenge the capitalist parties and also challenge the rising right wing in the form of Reform UK and Farage. In this episode, I'll be interviewing two Socialist Alternative activists, Mike and Ellie, about how this alternative can be built. Before we get started, if you like what you hear in this episode, why not get in touch with Socialist Alternative about joining today? If you'd like to get more information on building a fighting resistance to Starmer, go to socialistalternative.info and click Get Involved. Now let's get on to the episode. To talk more about this election in this podcast, I have here with me Mike, who's an NHS campaigner, a lifelong trade union activist, and he's a member of Socialist Alternative in Huddersfield. So hello, Mike.
Good evening.
And I have here with me as well Ellie, who is a PCS union member and a member of Socialist Alternative in Merseyside as well. Hello, Ellie.
Hello.
I'm going to start us off with a question for Mike then, because I think, we're all in agreement and it's pretty uncontroversial that the Tories are on their way out and they're really in a process of, total collapse, really. But people aren't inspired by what Labour has on offer either. So, I suppose the question that I would ask you, Mike, is what do you think this election's going to go down in history as?
Well, I've been involved in election campaigns since 1972, and I can say without any shadow of a doubt, this is the most boring election campaign I've ever witnessed or been involved in, but also potentially it is the most significant. If the election was happening today on Thursday, then we'd have to say that Sunak would be relieved and the rest of us would as well, and we could get on with our lives. But what we're witnessing is the potential collapse of the Tory party, a possible wipeout in reality of the Conservative Party. Now, this is the most successful bourgeois party in history, but they've come to the end of their rope. Brexit, I think, bought them some time in 2019, but the chickens now are definitely coming home to roost. And why is that? Well, there's the cost of living crisis, which has impacted all classes in society, but particularly the working class. Energy bills have shot up by over 50%, are staying there. This is a corrupt and a sleazy party. We've had the hypocrisy over COVID, where they partied on in Downing Street while people were dying in their tens and hundreds. We've had the farce of Brexit, which has just brought more expense and jacked up the price of exports. And we've had huge cuts in public expenditure, where public services really have ground to a halt and have stopped working. So little wonder that the Tory party are on their way out. What's happening now is there's a fight over the soul of the Tory party. It's moving in a Trumpist direction. Successors include potentially Badenoch, Braverman, but also maybe Penny Mordaunt, we don't know. After 1997, when Tony Blair won the general election for Labour, there were 4 different Tory leaders before Cameron took over in 2008. So they could be out of office for a while, but they could also implode, which I think is hugely significant. And for that, I think the election will be remembered. But we're also witnessing now, coming up on the outside right lane, the rise of Reform UK and Farage. He spent some time in America. He's trying to ape what's been going on with Trump and the Republican Party. He's trying to make this election all about immigration. He's said that his target in the next 5 years is to become Prime Minister, whether that's from Reform UK or the Tory party, we don't know. Potentially, he could become the next leader of the Tory party. But what we do know is that Labour in power will fan the flames of right-wing populism in this country. We've seen what's happened in France with National Rally. They emerged from the ashes of Francois Hollande's French government that was kicked out of power in 2012. And Starmer will win this election, not because of what he's saying, but because he's not a Tory. But potentially because of his failed policies, we could see the rise of the populist far right, which is something that we're going to have to combat. There's also a crisis across all of the major political parties in terms of their leadership. We've had change of leaders in the Republic of Ireland, in Northern Ireland, in Wales and in Scotland. But I do want to dwell in particular on what's been happening in Scotland, because the Scottish National Party was a party that was in the ascendancy and has been in government for more than a decade, and was the strongest and predominant party in Scotland and in the minds of ordinary Scottish people. And it's imploded. Like all the other parties, it's imploded because of the crisis that afflicts all of the major political institutions at the moment. Now we have a so-called safe pair of hands in the form of Sweeney, who in reality is a pro-capitalist, pro-business politician, and he has shifted the Scottish National Party to the right. The jury is out, but I think all the predictions is that the SNP is going to see a huge loss of seats, just as a huge loss of credibility. Now, he's had to try and inscribe on the banner of this reformed SNP the idea of independence, with absolutely no idea how that can be brought about. So we would also support the right of self-determination for the Scottish people. We would fight for and support an independent Scotland, but we have to make clear that we're in favour of the unity of the working class. So we would see an independent Scotland as part of a federation of socialist states. And what Scotland urgently needs, as in the rest of the countries that I've mentioned, as well as in England itself, is it needs a new workers' party, a new party of the left that's going to be based on the many struggles that have taken place in Scotland over the past period. And there will be activists and socialists who would step forward to belong to that party, who are totally disillusioned with all the major capitalist parties, but yearn for the idea of independence, to be freed from the Westminster bubble, which has been so corrosive in British politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you've already mentioned the name of Keir Starmer there, and obviously all of the signs point towards Labour becoming the next, the next party in government. But that doesn't mean it's smooth sailing for Starmer either, does it? It doesn't mean he's particularly popular in any way. Is there anything more you think you could say about
that? Where should I start? There's lots of people that could give you reasons for that. On a personal level, although elections should never be about personalities, but he is robotic and soulless. But in reality, I think that people's experience of Starmer is that he's someone who can't be trusted. He stood, let's remind ourselves, in the shadow of Jeremy Corbyn, stood on his shoulders and said that he would continue the legacy of Jeremy Corbyn, but he has executed so far 28 different U-turns since he was elected leader of the Labour Party and counting. He's actually said that he wants to encourage people to get rich. Now, all of us would like to be a bit better off. But the rich over the last 40 years have got richer, but particularly in the last 5 years, the gap between the rich and the poor has got wider than it's ever been. He's welcomed 3 Tory MPs into his ranks and onto the Labour front bench for one of them, whilst expelling Corbyn and thousands of others. And that is a huge cause for concern. There are glaring problems in Britain, and people are looking to Starmer, who's talking of change, to resolve them. If I give just 4 brief examples, the Health Foundation estimates that the NHS needs £37 billion in order to stay afloat. What we're getting promised by West Streeting is the introduction of the private sector on a bigger scale. There has been 3.6 million hours of released untreated sewage into the sea and rivers, which is the worst on record, where only 14% of rivers are now judged to be ecologically sound. And what we've been promised by Labour and Starmer? Regulation. It's absolutely crying out for nationalisation, which would be supported by the vast majority of the people. 60% of trains don't run on time. The infrastructure on British Rail is falling apart. And what we're being promised is gradual, piecemeal, potential renationalisation. 1/4 of councils in the next 2 years are forecast to go bankrupt. And we're being told that there's no magic money tree to fund public services at local authority level. For failing public services, what is Labour's answer? They don't have one, other than that there's no magic money tree. In the newspapers just recently, they've forecast that within the next 3 weeks after the general election, the prisons will be full to capacity. And what we're being promised by the front bench, shadow front bench, is a review of the situation. And Starmer has taken an horrific position on Gaza. He agreed to the idea that energy and water supplies should be cut off to the population of Gaza.
Israel must have that, does have that right to defend herself.
A siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water? Sakir?
Well, I think that Israel does have that right.
And over 100 arms licenses have been granted by UK since the 7th of October last year. And Labour has said that they will continue rearming Israel or providing arms to Israel. So that position is punishing Starmer and is seeing literally hundreds of thousands of young people deserting Labour because of its position on Israel-Palestine. After a brief honeymoon period where he's supposedly promising change, the only people I think that will be cheering on Labour at the general election is going to be big business, because Starmer has transformed Labour into a pro-business party. And that is a party, unfortunately, that will represent the interests of the rich and not the interests of the rest of us. Struggles are breaking out, and more will break out, and that there will be people who are willing to resist and fight back. And it's those people that we will stand with a socialist alternative to resist the worst of the pro-capitalist policies of the Labour Party.
Well, I guess on that note, actually, because it takes us on very well to the next question. I mean, given it's very clear now that Labour will form the next government and Starmer's going to be the next Prime Minister, I suppose this is a question for Ellie. What should we actually expect from a Labour government, given obviously what Mike has just said?
Yeah, so there have been comparisons made to the last time the Labour Party defeated the Tories in the election, which was in 1997. However, the political situation in 2024 is very different, so it's not going to be, a repeat of that. So when Labour come to power, there'll be increasing inflation. That's seen the cost of living really just massively climb for ordinary people in recent years. Public sector wages have been really stagnant, including for healthcare workers like nurses and junior doctors. And of course, Tory austerity has made public services much, much worse. And all of these things were one of the main factors that led to an unprecedented wave of strike action between 2022 and 2023. On some days, that was the most working days lost to strike action since the 1980s.
When teachers' pay is under attack, what do we do? Stand up, fight back! When teachers' pay is under attack, what do we do? Stand up, fight back!
And we've also heard Starmer repeat some of the language that the Tories used when they implemented austerity. So, for example, Labour are right when they say that the Tories have left the country in a mess, but they've using this language as if to set the expectation of what working class people can expect from a Labour government. So, and using this to justify rolling back on pledges, as Mike has already mentioned. Rachel Reeves is also committed to the fiscal rules, so-called, and will not reverse any of the Tory spending cuts. So we should totally expect that the next Labour government will be implementing cuts as well.
Yeah, and I suppose what that really poses then is like the need for continued struggle under a Labour government, that we can't just say, oh, well, that's it, Tories out, jobs are good, and, let's see how it goes. We need to be prepared to organise mass struggle. What sort of mass struggle do you think is going to be needed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that definitely includes struggle in trade unions. I mentioned the strike wave earlier, which saw many public sector workers, healthcare workers, civil servants, rail workers, mail, etc., on strike for pay that was in line with inflation to keep up with the cost of living crisis. Yeah, and of course, there's other areas of struggle. So, for instance, between now and the general election, Pride celebrations and, more importantly, Pride protests will be happening.
What do we want? Trans rights! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Trans rights! When do we want it? Now!
The Tories have really used the culture wars to sort of because they have nothing to offer working people, basically. And they've really whipped up hatred and division, particularly on issues around trans rights and refugee rights. And they've pulled the Labour Party with them right to very much to the right on many social issues. So Keir Starmer, and another one of his U-turns in 2020, said that they supported trans rights and their right to self-identify, which is a key demand for trans people. However, more recently, he's repeated culture war rhetoric and gone back on these promises. He supported the proposed ban from the Tories to discriminate against trans people, separating them on hospital wars. We will need to continue to make Pride a protest this year, organising around key demands to fight for all year, such as trans-inclusive and fully funded healthcare.
When I say trans rights, you say matter! Trans rights matter! Trans rights matter! When I say trans rights, you say matter! Trans rights matter! Trans rights matter!
And also, Labour sort of represented business as usual for British imperialism, like Mike was describing earlier, how Starmer is totally behind the ongoing mass slaughter in Gaza. But across the country, in so many towns and cities, hundreds of thousands of people have been out on the street regularly on protests in solidarity with Palestinian people and in solidarity with Gaza, calling for an immediate ceasefire.
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
We also saw student encampments spring up across various universities in the country, and that was a really, really significant that movement had spread from the US and then globally. So these protests are very likely to continue after the 5th of July. So we will be attending them and we will be raising the need for a new party, one that's anti-war and one that represents the interests of all working class people, including those who are more marginalised, like trans people and refugees. But I know we can talk more about a new party in a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. We can come back onto that because it's a really core part of what we need to be arguing for and putting forward at this point in time. I just because you were talking about what the nature of a Starmer government is going to be, and both you and Mike were saying this will be a government that really kowtows and represents the interests of the multimillionaires and the billionaires. And there's lots of evidence of that already. You don't have to take our word for it. I mean, there's one thing that that I think is really worth bringing up. There's been news over the last week, really, of a growing number of multimillionaires and billionaires and CEOs back in Labour. There was news over the last week, for example, of the Manchester United owner, as well as the Phones for You owner, John Cordwell. So he said,
over the last 2 or 3 months, I've looked at the Labour manifesto, looked at what they stand for, and gradually, slowly and grudgingly, after 50 years of Conservative support, moved their way. The real clincher was on Friday. I was in a business conference that they were holding, and there was 50 chief executives of some of the biggest companies in the UK, representing £4 billion worth of market cap. Sorry, yeah, it was much more than that. The number was 4 trillion, not 4 billion, 4 trillion pounds of market cap. And the, not camaraderie, but the empathy from Rachel Reeves and the other people in the Labour Party and these senior businessmen was clear. What Keir has done, as far as I can see, has taken all the left out of the Labour Party, and he's come out with a brilliant set of values and principles and ways of growing Britain in complete alignment with my views as a commercial capitalist.
Yeah, and I suppose this is really important, isn't it? Because, Mike was talking about the rise of Reform and Farage, because we've been clear that when you have these governments elected that don't fundamentally provide any kind of change for working class people and represent a continuation of business as usual under capitalism, what you begin to see then is the far right beginning to grow, isn't it? That's a key thing. And is there anything you can say about that?
Yeah, definitely. I suppose in the US it's a similar dynamic as in the UK, two major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, who don't represent any real choice for working class people. You know, Trump, of course, is very openly racist, openly anti-immigrant, homophobic, misogynistic, many more. But under Biden, forced migration deportations doubled in 2022. The worst rolling back of women's and people who can get pregnant's bodily autonomy rights, as in the overturning of Roe v. Wade took place. He banned rail workers from taking strike action, spends billions in arms shipments to the Ukraine, which is a very unpopular war, and of course full support of the Israeli state's genocidal war on Gaza. And, you know, on top of all that, the so-called progressives of the Democrat Party, Bernie Sanders, AOC, other members of the squad, have really endorsed many of Biden's actions, which essentially gives them like a progressive sort of veneer, you know? And it allows, and that's the crucial part, isn't it? It allows for Trump to posture as the anti-war candidate, as the candidate who can get Putin around the table with Zelensky and sort it all out. And it's really like emboldened individual, very right-wing characters in the US to campaign on all sorts of culture war issues, as in the UK. So for working class people in the States, and the choice Trump versus Biden is a real dire one.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a very dire choice in this election as well, and I think that's been the main feature that we've actually seen when we do socialist alternative campaign stalls and we ask people on the street, what do you actually think about, you know, the options being put forward to you? The overall answer is, well, I don't really like any of them. Maybe I'll vote Labour to get the Tories out, but that doesn't mean I'm enthusiastic in any way for what Starmer's putting forward. Actually, most people don't even know what Starmer is putting forward because he's extremely cagey about it. But obviously, you know, naturally, given that very dire choice in this election, a lot of people are beginning to think, what alternative can we actually build?
I understand that how you were saying just now, like a lot of people will just vote Labour to get the Tories out through gritted teeth, maybe not very excited. Some people may vote for sort of independence in their area, which we can kind of circle back to in a moment. But yeah, as we've said, Labour doesn't represent any fundamental alternative, and that's because they represent the interests of the capitalist system. They want to appear to big business as a safe pair of hands, basically. Rachel Reeves said that the Labour manifesto had big business's fingerprints all over it. But working class people have the opposite interests to big business, don't we? You know, we need decent housing, good jobs, a world free from violence, oppression and war, and a programme to protect the planet from the real emergency that is the climate crisis. Yeah, so as I mentioned, some people may vote for anti-war independence in their area. For example, Jeremy Corbyn in Islington North is standing independently after Starmer removed the whip from him.
This country has become more divided than ever. There are more people living in desperate poverty than I've ever known. There are more people using food banks and more families wondering how on earth they can make ends meet. Young people who can't get anywhere to live, people with children living in a very overcrowded place, people in the private rented sector facing high rents and insecurity. We're not going to end any of this without fundamental change, fundamental redistribution of power and of wealth, public ownership of water, mail, energy companies. Other countries manage to control rent and control the private rented sector. Why can't we?
Faiza Shaheen is also running independently after Labour blocked her from standing for the Labour Party. So Corbyn and Shaheen are, you know, popular figures. Corbyn especially with like a large base of support. And Socialist Alternative has been going along to where campaigns are happening for Corbyn, showing our support and helping to mobilise that base of support that they have. However, there are limitations, aren't there, to running independents here and there, mainly that they are individuals who may have similar politics, but as it stands, there's no way to really link up their campaigns with others, like Pride, struggles in trade unions, the anti-war campaigns, climate campaigners against racist deportations, against gender-based violence, etc. That just sort of shows that we need a new party for the working class, and for all of these struggles, a party of struggle, which Mike can go into a little bit more detail. But as we've discussed under Labour, we will need to carry on building this resistance, and resistance to attacks on workers wherever they happen. So that's why Socialist Alternative are calling for conferences of resistance. And these could be local or national, made up of campaigners, of trade unionists, of independents, and any individual basically who wants to participate in this. And it can be somewhere where we can kind of get together and democratically discuss what's the best strategy going forward, and what are some demands that we should raise as well.
Just to take it back to Mike then, because that really begs the question, if we're arguing for a new party and saying that a new party is exactly what's needed right now, what sort of party do we think it actually has to be? What does it have to stand for, and how does it have to organise itself?
Well, we call for a new mass party of struggle on the left. And the reason why we call for that is because what we can't afford to happen is the current spectacle that we have of some of the independents, many of whom are well-intentioned, but in reality, those that are standing in the general election, and they're actually standing in 1/4 of all of the constituencies across the country, which is significant in itself, and we should see how they do. But most of them have selected themselves, or a handful of people have selected them, and they have presented themselves to the electorate as a fait accompli. Now, there's a problem with that, isn't there? Because if people can select themselves and even get elected on the basis of popular support or disillusionment with Labour's policy on Gaza, there is no check on these individuals, and certainly no mass base upon which they can call in order to mobilise support for the policies that they stand for. So the kind of party that we need is a party that is, first of all, democratic, a party that is based in the mass struggles that have just been talked about. Ellie was talking about bringing together those people who've been involved in struggle over the last 2 to 3 years, and who, in my opinion, will actually step up their struggles after the general election. Anti-war protesters. Unfortunately, this conflict in Gaza is not going to come to an end within the next fortnight. In fact, every sign is that it's going to be escalated onto Israel's northern border with an all-out attack on Lebanon. And so the anti-war protesters will continue on the streets trying to make their voices heard. Striking workers and trade unionists. And there are, of course, junior doctors' strikes taking place this week. And there are other workers who will be forced into struggle. Community campaigners. And I'm chair of Stop the Cuts in Kirklees. And there's a number of people who've been campaigning against the cuts and to keep open things like leisure centres, old people's homes, protect jobs and services, and many of those are looking for an alternative. Environmental activists, climate campaigners are becoming increasingly disturbed and angry, of course, about the rapid escalation that we have towards increasing dependence on fossil fuels and the burning of carbon. And all the oppressed sections of society who've taken to the streets over the last 2 to 3 years. Obviously, women who have been protesting about the inequality that they face in society, in particular around many of the unfortunate and tragic murders that we've seen, such as Sarah Everard. We had the Black Lives Matter movement. We've had protests around LGBTQ rights. And all of these have a voice and need a voice. They look towards Labour and they ask the question, what are they doing for me? And so we need a call for all of these activists to be brought together into a wider alliance, kicking off with a conference indeed, but from that, a network of activists that can be pulled together into a party. And that part, whether it's called a party or an alliance, but it's a party that will need a programme, because people will want to see that a party such as that has got something alternative to the pro-big business parties that they're being currently confronted with. So a conference of resistance will not only need to bring together those activists, but to hammer out a fighting programme. And of course, members of Socialist Alternative will be advocating the programme around which we stand. For example, we need a living wage. That would get tremendous support from millions of workers who've been striking for a decent living wage over the resistance that we saw in the last 2 years. We need a shorter working week. And those experiments that have already taken place in workplaces, where they've reduced the working week to 4 days, have shown that, one, productivity massively increases, there's little turnover amongst the workforce, and sickness levels decline. So a shorter working week will improve everything, both for the employer and for the workers. We need, and this is a dire crisis in this country now, cheap and affordable housing. We have a profound housing crisis where mortgages and rents have rocketed over the past period. And it's possible with the brownfield sites that currently exist, it would be possible to build 1 million new houses a year, never mind Labour's modest target of 300,000, by putting building workers to work, mobilising public services, and putting the investment where it's urgently needed. We would want to see the utilities nationalised, but under the control of the workers and the management of the workers where they operate. And that's all of the utilities, in the energy sector, obviously in the water and the rail that I've mentioned, the Royal Mail, all of these need to be brought back under public ownership. And we need properly funded public services. Now, I've mentioned the dire crisis that faces the health service and council services and other public services, particularly in the field of education. Without a massive and immediate injection of funds into those services, we're going to witness the continued decline and, in some cases, the falling apart of some of these vital services that hold together a civilized society. We need equal rights for all. And if that's inscribed on our banner, then it will appeal to all those oppressed sections of society that I've mentioned. And that would include working people who are desperately looking for the shackles being taken over their right to organise. We have a ballot taking place in Amazon in Coventry, where workers are voting for the right to belong to a trade union, with a party that says you have an automatic right to belong to a trade union, that they aren't the restrictions that we have at the moment under the trade union legislation, then that will give workers a powerful voice and give them the leverage in the workplace to begin to redress the balance, where the rich have got richer and workers have got poorer. And we want to expropriate the rich. I haven't used many statistics, but one horrifying statistic that came out last week is that Elon Musk has just been approved a pay rise of $56 billion. That's absolutely obscene. And we want to redress that by making sure that the rich who avoid paying tax don't pay a tax at all. Accountants do a wonderful job to assist them in that process. We've got to make sure that the rich are paying their way and that they are properly expropriated by a party that stands for equality and for the nationalisation of the major levers of the economy. And clearly, of course, we need an end to war. There is growing militarisation taking place in capitalist society at the moment, where I read the other day that the increase in arms expenditure just last year was nearly $100 billion. So what that means is that the money that is being funneled into the nuclear arms industry and towards war can be given over to ensuring that we do away with poverty and want, and instead we see equality across the world. That is a socialist programme. And by the way, I think if that was put to people on the streets, it would get overwhelming support. But at the moment, there isn't a party that articulates that, and we urgently need one.
Thanks to our two guests for coming on to this episode of Revolutionary Ideas, the monthly Marxist podcast from Socialist Alternative. If you liked what you heard, again, don't forget to get in touch and join Socialist Alternative. To get involved, go to socialistalternative.info and make sure to click Get Involved and leave your details there. Also, please give us a follow on social media. On Instagram, we are at socialistalternative.ews. On Twitter, we're at Socialist Alt EWS. On Facebook, we're Socialist Alternative, ISA England, Wales and Scotland. And last but not least, on TikTok, we're Socialist_vids. With that said, thanks a lot and goodbye.